So, can everybody hear me? Everybody hear me okay? Okay, so thank you. Thank you for having us. This is our pleasure. I think I can speak for Melinda. It's our pleasure to talk about this. It's something very interesting to both of us, something we've given a lot of thought to. In fact, Melinda leads in many terms. She sort of discusses the public history of civil rights movement. All right. So history is written by the victors, right? History is written by the victors. Everybody's heard that before. Right? It's a saying, that very common saying that is attributed to a variety of people. I still don't know if it's actually any other group. One that coined this phrase, but I've heard it attributed to Churchill, to Nehru, to Napoleon, as well as many others. But in any event, whoever said it first, it's a truism, right? History is written by the victors. Everybody knows that. Except, of course, when we're talking about the history of the Civil War and the Confederacy. In which case, there is a public history out there that tells a very different story than the one the victors would tell. So what is public history? I'm not going to get a lot into it, but public history, generally speaking, is history that is presented outside of academic setting, right? So a lot of different forms that can come in, but think of the 3 M's. Museums, memorials, and monuments. Isn't that a name of one of your courses? Did you add movies?
Oh yes, we changed it to, sex it up history. Monuments, museums.
Yeah, okay. So museums, memorials, and monuments. Right. And so the monuments, there are thousands of monuments in the United States, mostly in the South, but not exclusively in the South, that tell the story of the Confederacy and the Civil War that is decidedly not from the perspective of the victors of that war, the Union Army. Right? But also, and this point is, I think, just as if not more interesting, it's also not the story of the Confederacy and the Civil War that is told by the Confederates themselves, which is something that my colleague Melinda will get into. It's a very different story. So what is that story? Well, so this is one of many Confederate monuments, one of thousands again across the South. This one is on the south lawn of the Texas State Capitol.
Oh.
And I was wandering by this one day, and I was very curious, what's this big thing there? So I went and read it. And so those are supposed, I thought there were supposed to be famous people, but those are supposed to be just your common Confederate soldiers, right? And then, so I read this plaque, this inscription, which I have here, and I realize it's hard to read, so I'll read it to you. But this is this. All right, died for state rights guaranteed under the Constitution. The people of the South, animated by the spirit of 1776, to preserve their rights, withdrew from the Federal Compact in 1861. The North resorted to coercion. The South, against overwhelming numbers and resources, fought until exhausted. Yes. During the war, there were 2,257 engagements. In 1,882 of these, at least one regiment took part. Number of men enlisted: Confederate armies 600,000, Federal armies 2,859,132, losses from all causes: Confederate 437,000, Federal 486,216. Okay. So this is a common story of the Confederacy and the Civil War that is told in thousands of monuments throughout the South and in some parts of the North. We'll get to that in a little bit. So what is the story being told here? All right, so there are 2 main components to this story. And then there's something glaringly missing. Right? But the 2 main components of this story are, one is the Confederacy, and the people who fought on behalf of the Confederacy were within their rights to do so. They were principled people who were within their rights, right? They were fighting for state rights in the spirit of 1776 and preserving their rights under the Constitution. Right? So they are principled men fighting for their rights, the Confederacy. The other thing is the Confederate soldiers, in this case, were dedicated and courageous people, fighting against all odds, right? Which is related to principle, but this comes in with the numbers. The number of people engaged against all odds. They fought until finally exhausted, right? But nobody could hope to win against these odds, but they did admirably well. Okay, so that's the general sort of two parts of the story here. Within their rights, one, and just incredibly courageous, two. Right? Courageous, tough, good soldiers, principled men. And then there's something that is not part of this story. What is that? Slavery. No mention of slavery. Of course, that's obvious, right? No mention of slavery. Slavery is not part of the story. This monument, come to find out, was erected around the same time as the Capitol building itself, or at the same time the Capitol building was completed, the Texas State Capitol, that is, in the 19 teens. Okay. As we'll see, that was not unusual among these Confederate monuments. All right. So what we have then is that story of principle and dedication and courage and the silencing of slavery. The silencing of slavery. But it's not, and this was sort of this tricky task of these Confederate monuments and memorials, it was by no means silencing white supremacy, right? So there's this, one aspect of it is silencing, although to be clear, they could never completely silence. It's not like anybody ever forgot that there were slaves in the United States. But they did sort of make it not really the main reason for the war, right? And then part of that process of silencing slavery, or subduing slavery anyway, is this reassertion of white supremacy. And we'll talk about how that was a little later on. But, so what we are going to do with the rest of the time today then is we have two historians here, and we're going to tell two different levels of history here, right? We're going to tell a story of history as it happened, and history as was said to have happened, right? So, history, what happened and what was said to have happened. Okay. So first, we're going to talk about why this all matters, right? I'm going to turn it over to Melinda. She's going to tell you, one, why it all matters. She's going to tell you the story of the Confederacy and the story that the Confederacy tells of the Civil War. And then I'm going to take over again and talk about the monuments going up, history of that, and then she's going to finish it off with the history of the monuments starting to come down.
Okay, so the Confederate statue debate is very complex. It's very charged, although I'm not entirely clear it's charged in this room, but just nationally, very charged debate. So it can be difficult to talk about. So before we launch into our discussion of it, what I want to do is talk about two things. And the first one is why this is so important, and then I want to propose a framework for thinking about these statutes. So first of all, why do we care? Why are we worried about what a statue communicates to people who just walk by it? That's kind of the so what question. It's just a statue. Why is it so important? I want to share with you a few statistics. I just want to share a few statistics that may come as a surprise to you. Studies tell us that only 1 out of 6 Americans ever takes a history class after high school. After that, most Americans are learning their history through public history outside the classroom. Again, monuments, battlefields, museums, movies, and for our purposes, of course, again, monuments. So public history is how many, many Americans learn their history. It's actually a study, by the way, that it was shown in the New York Times a couple years ago, that people believe the history they see in movies Even if they walk in knowing some of it's wrong, when they walk out, they kind of believe what it is. Here's another statistic. A recent survey indicated that only 50% of Americans believe that the history they hear in a classroom from a teacher is accurate, and 80% believe the history they see in a public history setting like a museum is accurate. So, public history is a central way that Americans learn their history, and Americans believe the history they learn in public history settings. Now, as Ken just suggested, one of the problems is that the public history is often presenting an inaccurate or an incomplete version. I'm going to show you another example that focuses on, in this case, a faithful slave monument. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a faithful slave monument, but there are quite a few of them throughout the South. This particular one was erected in 1895, and here's a couple images. The life of a slave. Here is the quote on this one. Dedicated to the faithful slaves who, loyal to a sacred trust, toiled for the support of the army with matchless devotion, with sterling fidelity guarded our defenseless homes, women, and children during the struggles for the principles of our Confederate States of America. Well, this may well be the way that Southerners remembered the men and women they enslaved 30 years after the war, but at the time they understood things very differently. Slaves had always resisted, but during the war this resistance escalated dramatically. Historians estimate, for example, that in the decades before the war, approximately 1,000 enslaved men and women escaped per year. During the years of the war itself, that number jumped dramatically. 150,000 enslaved men and women ran away each year, usually running to different lines. So one plantation owner wrote, quote, "We went to sleep one night with a plantation full of Negroes and woke to find not one in place." Those who stayed on the plantation often showed their true feelings in other ways. Another historian writes, quote, "Southern whites were shocked to discover that the average domestic slave would be far more likely to lead Union soldiers to the family silver rather than to hide and guard it." Or, as one Confederate woman said, "As to the idea of a faithful servant, it is all a fiction." So, again, the history that public history tells is often inaccurate. And finally, these false understandings of history have consequences. For example, and here is my final set of statistics, 84% of Americans agree that there is racial and ethnic hostility in the United States. Here is a 2017 Gallup poll that says the percentage of Americans who worried about race relations a great deal rose, as you can see, from 14% to 42%. And race relations actually come in third as, quote, "the most important problem in the United States, right behind economic problems and dissatisfaction with government or leadership." So Americans know that race is a problem. Most want to make it better. In an effort to confront the kinds of historical traumas that have brought us to this point, slavery, Jim Crow, other countries have established truth and reconciliation commissions. But in the words of Brian Stevenson, truth and reconciliation has always been sequential. You can't get to reconciliation until you've got to truth. And you've not done a very good job of telling. So Americans learn their history from public history, including monuments. They believe what they learn. It's not infrequently inaccurate, and there are consequences. So we have a lot at stake here. I want to propose now a framework for ways to think about Confederate statue issue, and Ken has sort of suggested this already. Historian James Lowen proposes this framework, so this is not mine. He calls, he says, public history is always a tale of two eras. The first is the history of the event itself. In our case, the Civil War, the Confederacy. The second is the era in which the statue was erected. And the idea here, the reason this is an important distinction, is that the images and the words on these documents, on these monuments, represent a moment in the past when, for reasons that are specific to the time, a group of individuals, whether from the public sector or the private sector, made a decision about who should be honored in public spaces. So these monuments reflect the attitudes and ideals of the time when Americans put them up. So Lawson says, whenever you see a monument, think about a tale of two eras. What is the history it's commemorating, and when did it go up? And what might we think about when we reflect on that for a moment? For our discussion today, I'm going to add a third era. Historian David Light says, an event's meaning is always made from subsequent history. Memory is always about the present. So how is our thinking about these monuments, about the history that they represent, about the drive to remove them, how is that affected, how is that shaped by events today? So this is how we're going to discuss monuments today. The history that is officially commemorated, the time during which the statues were erected, and in this case, the time during which the controversy over the statue has erected. So for today, it's a tale of three eras. So I'm going to talk first about the first era. Historians argue about many things. Might even be they argue about most things. But one thing that they have at this point reached consensus on is the cause of the Civil War, which was in fact slavery. Now, within that broad consensus, there are certainly further debates. There are arguments about, for instance, why was slavery so divisive? But after decades of debate, they have come to agree that slavery lay at the heart of the Civil War and at the heart of the Confederacy. In the words of historian Charles Joyner, quote, the historical record clearly shows that the cause for which the South seceded and fought a devastating war was slavery. I'm just going to give you a tiny sampling of some of the evidence that speaks to this issue. The first two examples I'm going to give you come from the Southern State Secession Conventions. You may have already seen this. Actually, shortly after Ken and I gave this talk, a couple of days later, we did this at the Union. People started telling us that the following night, that Stephen Colbert had done, apparently, at any rate, so I believe he used this kind of evidence, so you folks may have seen some of this evidence. But these are actually documents that the seceding states produced to explain to the public why they're seceding. So here's Mississippi. This is a declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. This is Texas, a declaration of the causes which impelled the state of Texas to secede from the federal union. We hold as undeniable truths that the government of the various states were established exclusively by the white race, and that the African race were rightfully held and regarded as inferior and dependent race. In this free government, the servitude of the African race is mutually beneficial to both bond and free. But really, in a way, the most powerful quote, and again, this may be something you're familiar with, comes from Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, who says, in a speech known as the Cornerstone speech, this is the Cornerstone quote, the prevailing ideas entertained by Jefferson rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Now, during the Civil War era, most people, North and South, understood this. The cause of the Civil War was slavery. And this is why Lincoln said in the second inaugural, quote, all knew that this interest, slavery, was somehow the cause of the war. But over time, this changed. In the years following the war, Southerners developed a new spin on the conflict and set out to ensure that that spin took hold in American memory. Their mythology came to be known as the Lost Cause. Among the important tenets of the Lost Cause, slavery was not the cause of conflict. The cause of conflict was states' rights. In fact, let me just tell you very quickly that there was a book called The Lost Cause, and this book had two editions. The first one was 1866, and it said, we've lost our cause, we fought the war for slavery. But the second edition, 2 years later, 1868, said, we've lost the cause, it was about states' rights. So this is very quickly moving into states' rights, and I'll speak more about why in a second. Second, it's a noble war. This is a war fought heroically by a virtuous agrarian South seeking independence from a grasping, greedy, ignoble North. Third, enslaved men and women were happy under slavery. They were treated really well in this version of history. They were treated like family. They were grateful to be civilized under the hand of this superior race. Because of all this, in light of this, slaves were freed against their will. You know what this is? Gone with the Wind. There's this great scene where Scarlett's running away, it's Reconstruction, and the enslaved men from her plantation are there getting ready to help her. So you see this all over in the Lost Cause. They're freed against their will. Now this was designed to erase certain realities from the nation's memory. The reality that slavery, increasingly viewed by not just the nation but the world at large as immoral, had in fact been the cornerstone of the Confederacy. The reality that brutality and violence have been central to the maintenance of slavery, and the reality that slavery played a critical role in the maintenance of white supremacy. So that's a bit about the first era, the history as it happened. Let's turn now to the second era, the time during which the monuments
So the Lost Cause here, I thought we should maybe title this talk The Lost Cause of the Lost Cause.
We did.
Or the Lost Cause is losing.
The Lost Cause. There were a lot of suggestions. His was The Lost Cause of the Lost Cause, which is the title. Look it up then. Not now.
So this is the story then, the story of the story, right? So you've got the idea of what the story that these monuments want to tell about the Civil War and the Confederacy. So now we're going to talk about the story of the story, how it developed. And in doing this, I'm going to address 6 questions. When, how, where, what, who, why. Okay, so when these monuments went up. And the when part of this is very important. Right, the when part. So again, when, in this order, when, how, where, what, who, why. So when. Let's see. This is a graph or chart. I guess it's a chart, graph, whatever it is, showing when the monuments were erected. Okay. And I'll just let you kind of take that in for a little bit.
You have us with the numbers?
Yeah.
We can't see the numbers.
1861, 1861, the beginning of the Civil War. I mean, you can see there's one big spike, all right? You can see another spike. So this is 1861, beginning of the Civil War, and 2016.
I think they might want to know what we're
I know. Jesus. So this is 1900, this is 1920. That's the first 2 decades of the 20th century.
And what did the red and blue?
So this is the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 1900, 1920. And there's some other dates I'm going to point out here in a second. And then this here, so you see, you know, it's lowered in level here, but it's maintaining, and this is in the 20s and the 30s, and then you see in the 1940s, and then right in the late 40s, not much of anything, the 50s, not a lot. And then you start seeing that in the late 50s into the 60s, you see another spike. Okay. So most of you can kind of see what's going on here, right? But so I want to point out a couple things about this diverse period. First of all, it's and I don't think this is the main factor, but it's about a generation removed from the Civil War itself. Yeah, sorry.
Can you tell us what the colors distinguish?
Yeah, sorry, that's a good point. The green are schools that are named after Confederate members, etc. You know, in Austin, Texas, there's a Bowie School, there's a Calhoun High, there's several Confederates that are there. And then the blue are monuments on courthouse grounds. Okay. Blue monuments on courthouse grounds, and red are other sites, so not on courthouse grounds. I guess this is to show that so much of this is on courthouse grounds, right? County courthouses. So, yes, any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, so you have, again, beginning of the Civil War to the present day, basically the big spike here in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and then it levels off, and then another spike in the mid-50s through the mid-60s. Okay? Right here is 1896, and I know you can't see what that says, but it's 1896, and it says Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay? So, yeah, I guess as I was saying earlier, one factor I think that's going on here is it's about a generation away from the end of the Civil War, so it's not like imminent, and in some ways it allows for reinterpretation because of the removal. But more importantly is what's going on in society at this time, of course, right? In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, I think, is incredibly important in all of this. So Reconstruction essentially lasts from the end of the Civil War to 1877, what's known as the Compromise of 1877, when Union troops were removed from the South. But it took about another 20 years for racial segregation to become ossified to the point to where it was constitutionalized by Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay? And to me, that's a very important moment because it's essentially saying, it's essentially the national government or the nation at large through the opinion of the Supreme Court and through the lack of any substantial protest to that decision, basically turning their back on the black people of the South and saying, you know, we're done with that. You guys in the South, you white guys in the South, you former Confederates, and you sons and daughters of former Confederates, you take over. And part of that taking over is the ossification of Jim Crow laws, the enactment throughout the South, and again through parts outside the South as well, of segregation laws, of techniques of voter suppression, and just as important, and I must say as well, in the most sort of gruesome aspect of all of this, in the rise of lynching. So lynching is at its height during this period. The second KKK is founded in 1915, by far the largest of all the KKKs. So basically we think of three main versions of the KKK, one founded during Reconstruction, one founded in 1915, and then one sort of revived during the Civil Rights era. So all of this is a result, at least in part, of the nation saying we're done with trying to deal with race relations in the South, we're going to turn it over to the white Southerners. And part of that is controlling the narrative through these monuments. Okay. Then you see a leveling off, and finally, in the second spike here, it's for a slightly different reason. Instead of, while we can explain this, I think, through the national government saying we no longer care, you know, Reconstruction's over, we no longer care, we can explain this through the opposite, through the national government starting to say, well, we do care. We care again. Right? Through the Supreme Court decision again, this time Brown versus Board of Education, outlawing mandated segregation in public schools. And there is a Southern reaction, response to that, with a second wave of erecting of these monuments, telling the story of the White South. All right, so that's the when. Okay, any questions about that, comments? Okay, so the how, I'm not going to talk a lot about it because the how is basically through these monuments, right? The how is monuments to Confederate soldiers, to Confederate generals. So we had the earlier Confederate soldiers, I won't go all the way back, but one of the Texas State Capitol, Confederate soldiers. Then we have Confederate generals. This is Nathan Bedford Forrest, very controversial one that was recently taken down. This is in Memphis, erected in 1906. Okay, and through Confederate, another Confederate general, right? This is Robert E. Lee, the Lee Circle in New Orleans, also recently removed. Right, erected one of the earlier ones in 1884. And then, this isn't exactly a Confederate statesman. This is John C. Calhoun, who you can't really call a Confederate statement, but certainly, you know, the protege, or sorry, I should say the mentor of these Confederate statesmen, right? The one that they all look up to. And this is, of course, in Charleston, South Carolina. And then if you want to talk about Confederate statesmen, there are Jefferson. I don't have an image of it, but there are just Jefferson Davis monuments all over the South. Right. Okay. So this is the how, through these monuments to all these structures, all these people representing the Confederacy. Okay. And it's also, the how is also in the size of these monuments, right? If you look at these three that I've shown you, especially this Calhoun one and this Lee one, they are imposing monuments, right? And they are sending a message, larger than life figures, and they're at these very specific locations as well. Lee Circle is at one of the busiest intersections in New Orleans, right? It's where the business district meets uptown, and there are people coming by there all the time there to send, and it's erected there with a particular purpose in mind. Okay, so that starts to get at the where, but I want to get back to the where more broadly. Where were these monuments erected? So this gives a, and this is recent, 2016, I believe, of all the Confederate monuments in each state. So as you can see, not surprisingly, Virginia has the most. You know, the capital of the Confederacy was in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, even though it started off in Montgomery, Alabama, but moved to Richmond, Virginia. Texas, in part because it is such a big state and such a populous state, has the second most. Georgia, not far behind. So, you know, lots of them. But also you can look at, what's interesting to me is the monuments that are in states that were not part of the Confederacy, right? So West Virginia didn't even become a state until the Civil War and became a state because it was opposed to secession. Kentucky never seceded. Missouri never seceded. Delaware never seceded. So these are places that were not part of the Confederacy with Confederate monuments. Okay, now those were all slave states, but there are some states that were not only not part of the Confederacy, but they were not slave states, and not only that, they were part of the Union, right? Pennsylvania with 4, New York with 3, Ohio with 3. These are monuments to the Confederacy. And then there's some places that weren't even states at the time. They didn't even exist as states that had monuments to the Confederacy. Oklahoma, Arizona, Mexico. So this is, of course, mostly a Southern thing. Of course, right? And it emanates from the South. But the point of this is to show that it had some legs, and it had so much legs that it started bleeding out of the South even. Right? I mean, I know you guys have seen Confederate flags in upstate New York, and in Vermont, and in New Hampshire. And that's all part of the same thing, that's buying into this narrative. Okay. When, how, where, what? We've talked a lot about this, right? The message. What is the message of this? I've discussed this. I'm not going to get a lot into it, right? The cause of the Confederacy was principled. The people of the Confederacy were courageous. But there's another message, and then the silencing of slavery. But there's another message that is wrapped up in all of that, and that is, this is the white man's country again. This is the white man's land again. Again, so this imposing figure of the founder of the KKK in the middle of Memphis, which became a majority black city, right? That's another thing about these. In all these cities in the South, most of them, or many of them anyway, are majority black. And they see this every day. Lee Circle, New Orleans, one of the blackest cities in the country. And they saw that every day. Okay. Calhoun, Charleston is not quite majority black, but there are a lot of black people living in Charleston that had to see this guy every day. Okay. And this is for a reason. Again, these imposing figures trying to send this particular message. We are in charge again. And some of the most chilling of all these monuments deal not with the Civil War itself, but with Reconstruction. Okay. This is in Louisiana, Colfax Parish. In Louisiana, they call them parishes, not counties, but Colfax Parish, Louisiana, where the Colfax, what historians call the Colfax Massacre, took place. Colfax Massacre is what we call it. What they call it in 1950, when this was erected in Colfax Parish, they call it the Colfax Riot. It was black people and carpetbaggers rioting, not white people massacring. Okay, so what happened here? This says here, on this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873 marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. This is erected in 1950. Okay. So the Colfax Massacre was a group of Republicans, a group of black Republicans, who had, it came after the disputed gubernatorial election of 1872. And Republicans and Democrats had both claimed victory in this election. And Republicans holed up in Colfax Parish Courthouse claiming they were the legitimate government. And in response to that, a group of men who belonged to an organization called the White League, which was Louisiana's version of the KKK at that time, came in, armed men, and massacred 150 unarmed black men. And they call this the Colfax Riot. In the same area in Colfax Parish, this, I know you can't read it, it's hard to read, erected to the memory of the heroes Stephen Decatur Parrish, James West Hadnot, Sidney Harris, who fell in the Colfax Riot fighting for white supremacy, April 13, 1873. So this is an unapologetic declaration that they were fighting for white supremacy.
And when was that what?
This was in the same time, 1950. All right, now, so the when, how, where, what? What about the who? Okay, who is erecting these monuments? Okay, well, the saddest thing, or the most alarming thing, I should say, is so many of them, as we can already see, are erected by governmental bodies. The state capital, the state of Texas, passed legislation to erect that monument, the first one I saw. County courthouses all over the place. You saw how many are county courthouses, right? This was the parish of Colfax who erected these monuments. Okay? So a lot of these are governments. But there are also some private organizations, many of them, the most important of which is probably the Daughters of the Confederacy. Right? The Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization formed from sort of ladies' auxiliary relief organizations that were formed during the Civil War, and then sort of a spin-off of that about 20 years later in 1890, or about 30 years later in the 1890s. Two different chapters, one in Nashville, Tennessee, and one in Savannah, Georgia, by two different women who thought they called themselves the Daughters of the Confederacy, and then they kind of heard about each other, and then they changed their name to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and within a matter of 10 years, they were at the peak of their popularity, with hundreds of chapters across the South. Okay. And the Daughters of the Confederacy had the purpose of honoring the soldiers who fought for the Confederacy. Okay? And most of this was done through the erection of monuments and memorials with the language that we see. Now, recently, if you go to the Daughters of the Confederacy website today, you will see that they explicitly state that they do not support unpatriotic people or racists. Right? They disavow people who are unpatriotic and racist. And of course, that reminds me of somebody if you have to say that, it's like when somebody says, I'm a stable genius. Right? If you have to say you're a stable genius, you're probably not. Right? And if you have to say we disavow it, then there's probably some questions about that. Okay. So, when, how, where, what, who, why. I'm not going to spend a lot about this because the why is really related very much to what. We've talked a lot about this. But the why question here is why, given what the Confederates themselves said about the cause of the Civil War, why do these monuments tell a different story? And that's sort of the question we've been addressing here. I want to leave that a little bit open, but I will say the heart of this is this moral cleansing aspect to it, right? I think, which allows for the justification of continuing oppression in the South. All right, now I'm going to turn it back over to Melinda for the last chapter of the story.
Okay, so what about today? If memory is always about the present, how have events in our era shaped the way we think about these monuments? And why, over 150 years after the Civil War ended, are these statues suddenly making headlines? Well, first, let me say that these monuments were always African Americans in particular complained about them, campaigned against them from the beginning. But many whites objected as well. So when we talk about today, what we're really asking is, why is it that these objections have suddenly crystallized into major protests? So they're always there, why are they crystallized? Well, first of all, there's a very broad historical context for understanding this, and my guess is that you can all guess at these things. The advances of the Civil Rights era, the election of the nation's first African-American president, the dramatic rise of hate groups and hate crimes in the wake of the election of the nation's first African-American president. The cell phone recordings that revealed the depths of race-related police brutality, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the election of Donald Trump, and the increase in hate crimes since that election. So all of these things set a kind of broad historical context for understanding the way that we view these monuments. More specifically, the current furor, as my guess is you guys know pretty well, began a little over 2 years ago. On June 17, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof entered the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, joined the 12 African Americans there engaged in worship, appeared to be worshiping with them for about an hour, and then shot and killed 9 of them. His goal, he said he wanted to reinstate segregation, and he wanted to start a civil war, specifically a racial war. And he had a website. And on this website, he had the following images. This is just a selection of himself posing with the Confederate flag. So we have these images all taken from his website and then publicized after that. And there were more. Well, the fact that Roof's murderous white supremacy was linked to and presumably even inspired by, symbols of the Confederacy triggered the debate on the display of the flag, but also of the display of monuments dedicated to the men who embraced the Confederacy's values. The irony, of course, was that Ruth had made the connection that lost cause advocates had been dancing around all these years. The Confederacy had, in fact, represented a violently enforced white supremacist racial order. So the question was whether it made sense to honor these men, to leave a statue of them in a public space frequented by the people of the community in a manner that was designed to elicit admiration, even veneration. After all, these figures are literally on pedestals. And there were a lot of them, as Ken just mentioned. A 2016 report from the Southern Poverty Law Center identified 718 Confederate monuments and statues. If we add in other symbols of the Confederacy, that number goes up to 1,505 Confederate symbols. And they're also, this is his map and mine, these are both from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So cities across the South began talking about whether they should change this. New Orleans was one of the earliest big cities to act on those plans. After 2 years of debate and planning, in May 2017, New Orleans removed 4 monuments dedicated to the Confederacy and to opponents of Reconstruction. The city workers who removed them had to wear protective gear and were guarded by police out of concern for their safety. Hours before their removal, Mayor Mitch Landrieu gave a speech. I don't know if any of you read or saw this speech, but it was an incredibly powerful speech. He said in part, quote, "These statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for. They were," he said, "erected purposefully to send a strong message to all who walked in their shadow, who was still in charge." The process of removing Confederate statues gained, as I'm sure you also know, dramatic momentum in the wake of events of Charlottesville, where white nationalists gathered officially to protest the removal of Robert E. Lee's statue. The people who attended this event, it was a Unite the Right rally, carrying torches. They chanted "Blood and soil," "White lives matter," "You will not replace us," "Jews will not replace us." And as, again, you all know, the demonstration ended with a terrorist attack as James Alex Fields drove the car into the counter-demonstrators, killing Heather Heyer. In the wake of Charlottesville, the campaign to take down statues escalated. I'm just going to show you a few that have been removed. This is one that was in Baltimore. You guys probably remember this because it was nighttime, right? The mayor said to protect people for public safety, she had them removed at nighttime. In Annapolis, Maryland, oh, this was my favorite tweet on that. They wrote in the lost cause, they wrote down on in Annapolis, Maryland, a statue of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. He's the one who wrote the Dred Scott decision that said that no black man had any rights that a white man had to respect. That statue was removed from the front of the courthouse. In Durham, North Carolina, and in other states, I'll mention that in a minute, laws prohibit the removal of statues, so protesters pulled down this statue of a Confederate soldier that also was in front of the courthouse. And there have been calls for the removal of many others. I'm going to show you a map which unfortunately is dated. This stuff has kind of left the public eye more than one would wish. But what you see are that there are calls for the ones that have come down. Let's see if my guide's not there. But the ones in red are proposed. Is that right?
Yeah, it looks
Yeah.
right.
The ones in, well, no, Stone Mountain, so the ones in black. I knew this.
Well,
Do you know?
more.
I'm guessing red is the one.
They
The
haven't
ones
taken
right
down
there,
Stone
yeah.
Mountain.
Well, because
that's
Stone
for
Mountain
sure.
didn't come down. You
No.
guys know this, right? They
Stone Mountain.
proposed that they erase us, but that's not going over well.
Mississippi.
Okay, and there are, as I suggested, I mean, there are a lot of obstacles to all this. There are laws. A lot of southern states have laws that prohibit the removal or modification of the statutes. Modification will become relevant when I talk about context in a minute. Virginia's law is the oldest. It's put in place in 1902, perhaps because they had so many statutes. But Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, North Carolina, and Tennessee all have passed laws in the 21st century. Several of those in the past 2 years following Dylan Bruce's murderous attack. What I want to do now is turn, this is going to be our discussion, but I want to turn and examine some of the arguments that have been made in response to the calls to take down these statutes. And so I'm going to show you some of the arguments. I have a document and I'll show them on the PowerPoint, and then we'll open up for questions about anything, but also these will give us sort of, you can think about some of the ways that people have talked about this, and some of it's a little surprising, who thinks what, so we can pass those out in just a minute. First, let me talk about, several of these are about the statues in Memphis. So I want to quickly go over the perspectives, but I'll tell you a little bit about the statue in Memphis, and Ken has already referenced it. There has been a call, and it has recently now, since we did this talk a couple months ago, we had to revise a lot of stuff, because these actually did come down, but there's still contention, there's still a debate over this. Nathan Bedford Forrest. So just so you understand, so when you look at the people's perspectives, who we're talking about, Forrest was a slave trader. He became a millionaire before the Civil War, selling thousands of men, women, and children in a Negro mart in Memphis. He also led the Fort Pillow Massacre, an 1864 Civil War battle that became a massacre when he, as lieutenant colonel, led his men to the killing of 350 Union soldiers after they had surrendered. The vast majority of these were black. And he was one of the founders and the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. So that was a statute that people called for the removal of. It did come back down this past December, and the quotes you'll see in your document and online were before that, but the process was a very tortured one, inasmuch as the way that the city had to do it due to these laws I told you about was they sold it to a private entity, which then took them down instantly, like as soon as they bought them. But that's being contested now. So it remains to be seen where that will go. So I want to look at these quotes that will give you a sort of variety of perspectives on the taking down of these statues. Then we'll pass up these documents and whatever questions. Lee Miller, son of the Confederate veteran, says the statue of Forrest represents what it always has, honor and valor. Forrest was a great community man. He was an inspiration for everyone. Nick Hicks, sales analyst and hip-hop MC. When I look at that statue, I see terrorism, racism, and white supremacy. It is blatant arrogance for it to be put in a public park in the middle of a city that is majority black. Forrest's great-great-grandson. Slavery was wrong, but that's the way it was back in history. George Washington owned slaves. Are you going to take him off the dollar bill? You cannot change history. The mayor. We can't change history. We can't unring a rung bell. But how long do we have to pay fealty to it? That's what monuments represent. Unresolved, we are going to remove it. Now we're into sort of more general statements, and it would seem naive to think we could instantly rid ourselves of our Confederate legacy by simply removing monuments and memorials. It would be a seductively easy out for communities to make amends for the tragedy of the past by merely removing monuments and memorials and declaring the shadows of the past suddenly expunged from their midst. It would be counterproductive to remove the very vestiges of and educational tools pertaining to Confederate memory when we need them now more than ever to help us talk through, work through, and understand so many of the reasons that society is the way it is today. These are also why in the year 2016 should communal spaces in the South continue to be sullied by tributes to those who defended slavery? How can Americans ignore the pain that black citizens especially must feel when they walk by John C. Calhoun Monument or any similar statues on their way to work, school, or Bible study? Here's the one that's most surprising. Ta-Nehisi Coast. I don't know if I want to forget that at some point, somebody was crazy enough to have a monument in native Bedford Forest. That's a statement about what society was. That shouldn't be forgotten. The final thing on this document that I'm going to hand out, again, just to sort of be reminded of different perspectives, is the idea of contextualization. That is, maybe what we do instead of taking the monument down is we put up a plaque that contextualizes it. And this was really interesting because when I led a class on a civil rights museum, we were looking at sites of the major civil rights actions, we went to Charleston and we saw the Calhoun monument that Ken has been talking about. And at that time, there was a proposed, here's another image, but there was proposed text for a contextual plaque. And I'm going to show you the proposed text, and then I'm going to show you the one that finally went out. This was stunning when we got to this one. This statue of John C. Calhoun is a relic of the crime against humanity, the folly of some political leaders, and the plague of racism. It remains standing today as a grave reminder that many South Carolinians once viewed Calhoun as worthy of memorialization, even though his political career was defined by his support of race-based slavery. Historic preservation, to which Charleston is dedicated, includes this monument as a lesson to future generations. So I was there with students, and they were like, here's what finally is supposed to go on. Well, honestly, the other one was a little longer, too. I edited, this one. But it's the first paragraph where they mostly did the changes. This monument to John C. Calhoun, erected in 1896, was the culmination of efforts begun in 1858 to commemorate his career. It was erected at a time after Reconstruction when most white South Carolinians believed in white supremacy and the state enacted legislation establishing racial segregation. These ideas are now universally condemned. I don't know, that's, what do you think? It goes on, the entire, this paragraph, which I'm not going to read, tells you first who he was, vice president, U.S. senator. Unlike many of the founding fathers who viewed the enslavement of Africans as a necessary evil possibly be overcome, Calhoun defended the institution of race-based slavery as a, quote, positive good. That's his phrase. The statue remains standing today as a reminder that many South Carolinians once viewed Calhoun as worthy of memorialization, even those political positions included his support of race-based slavery, an institution repugnant to the core ideas and values of the United States of America. Historic preservation, to which Charleston is dedicated, includes this. Okay, so we are now opening this to questions of any sort. These are, this document just contains all those reactions, partly to represent, thank you, a spectrum of views on monument taking down. So, we're done. Questions? Okay, so I saw her hand first.
Yes, I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned that in Texas. 23 years ago, my husband and I, he came from New York City, I came from far upstate New York, and we had to go to Austin, Texas. So on Saturday afternoon, there wasn't much to do, so we wandered around the state capitol. And we were totally shocked at all those statues. And you only had one statue there, but it's full of statues.
Yeah, there's one other to Confederacy. It's not all, there's some other stuff. Like, it's a lot of offensive stuff, don't get me wrong, right? Mexican War and all that stuff. Yeah.
Right, but there's piles of things to Confederacy. We were totally shocked. We had never seen anything like that, either of us. And I was, in my grade school, we fought the Civil War over again on the other side.
Yeah, the Texas State Capitol also faces south, turns its back to the north.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is also typical of a lot of state capitals, county courthouse.
Did you get?
Yeah. You can call it.
Yeah, I think one of the problems about the whole debate around statues is that, like a lot of history, it's kind of taken out of context. It's from the one thing you talk about and not the whole context. If you see, for instance, the way Germany handled Nazism after World War I, it was illegal to have statues outside of a museum. It was illegal to have swastikas. All the schools had to have mandatory courses on anti-Semitism and Nazism, what was wrong. We've never dealt with white supremacy and racism in that context. And so that allows this kind of thing to flourish. We can have these statues and so forth all over the place. And I think that's part of the problem is that racism and white supremacy are really
I couldn't agree
No,
more.
I absolutely
Could not agree more. I mean, I
And the
think,
last question is, where are those 3 monuments in New York State?
thank you. New
Yes.
York City. I think New York City. Oh,
Yeah, oh, yes, correct.
What did this do?
So I just want to get your reaction to this, which is there's always been an effort to separate soldier service from the effect of what the soldier did. So these monuments in the South are about the valor of the soldier, not what he was fighting for. When we came back from Vietnam, we were supposed to respect those soldiers and forget about what they did in Vietnam. And we're supposed to respect the Iraqi soldiers and forget about the fact that there were no weapons of mass destruction. The separation always happens.
Well, it's supposed that, and I mean, you know, there's all this stuff about, yeah, anyway. Why don't you go?
Well, I just have a couple thoughts
Yeah.
that I'll just throw out there. And one of them is, it doesn't happen with Nazi soldiers,
Yeah.
right? You don't see a lot of SS. And I say that because there are causes which are fought, which simply don't get commemorated because they're on the wrong side of history. So I'm not sure.
Nor do we
and I-
celebrate enemy combatants of the United States, which is, let's face it, that's what the Confederacy was.
And that's a really important point. They're not American veterans because they seceded. They were treasonous, actually. The other point I'm just going to make is that, is that this is 5 generations out, is what I recently read. And one of the issues with the South is that because there was so little immigration into the South in the years following the war, and in fact there was immigration out of the South during the Civil War, and because more Confederate soldiers proportionally were killed during the war, a higher number of people in the South have ancestors who fought in the war. But it is 5 generations out. And so this idea that it's heritage, that they really need to honor their relatives, I get that a greater proportion of them have ancestors, but again, it's a really long time ago. This is not your father, your grandfather who died. So any kind of personal need to separate those two, I don't know what to do.
Well, I think it's really important to understand, and I think this is part of that message, to understand that the vast majority of those fighting for the Confederacy, risking their lives, dying for the Confederacy, were not slaveholders, right? And were not fighting for their own interests.
And we're drafted.
Yeah, and we're drafted. But I think that's important to understand because I think, you know, in that sense, things might not change. I mean, there's a lesson to learn there about people who are demonized doing the dirty work for the real demons, I guess. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of like that. You have one photo up there of a statue with multiple people on it who were presumably ordinary soldiers. And there are cemeteries with Confederate soldiers, which is different than having a statue of the general leaders of the idea. That's a different kind of thing. One thing about the, I believe that you declared that the soldiers who fell on both sides were considered to be Americans.
Yeah,
Eventually.
sure.
It's a conciliation kind of.
Well, no, but sure for Lincoln.
For Lincoln,
Yeah.
But,
Yes.
when the issue of taking down statues or maybe erasing a monument on a mountain carved in, I remember one thing that the Taliban was deleting the Buddhist statues carved into a mountain. That was extremely offensive to me. I think it's like erasing archaeological things in history. And that's a little bit like getting rid of some, but not most of these. I mean, that's a stretch to go. You might look at that as Mount Rushmore if somebody else wanted.
Are you raising the question of art, sort of, or
Well,
cultural?
it's another culture. It's certainly not, those statues were not meaningful. They were offensive to the Taliban thinking. Now, but this is real. That's probably really too, I don't know, is that too different? I mean, it's hugely different time. And this was a civil war here in an insane time. So perhaps they're really too different to compare.
Well, I go back to this point of Andrew.
You go for it.
Well, no, I just go back to this point about Nazis. I mean, I think we can create a spectrum that says, what do we feel about walking by a statue of Hitler every day as a Jewish child? Well, that's how we might want to feel about Calhoun, whose chief contribution to American society was the defense of slavery. So, if you think of it as a spectrum, then we get to have that conversation that this guy raises on one of these about, what about Washington? Well, there is this notion that you can weigh contributions. You can say, yes, Washington was a slave owner. This is going to sound off topic, but it's not. There's a documentary about the making of the play Hamilton, and in it, they're interviewing W. Dees about his representation of Jefferson. And they're asking him what he is black, and they're saying, well, you know, what do you think about this? Because he's a brilliant man, he contributed so much, Declaration of President, and he sucks. And I felt like that's it. And he's saying we have to recognize both sides, right? We have to say our heroes sucked, and if they contributed enough to get a statue, great, and then put on a little plaque. By the way, this guy sucked. In this sense.
In some ways.
In some ways. Oh yes, absolutely. In some ways.
And I think
But some people don't get that.
I think it's worth, that's a point, definitely worth bringing up. And I think there's a couple of things that would lead, more than a couple, but a couple of things I'll talk about that lead me to believe that there are differences, right? And important differences. And one is, I don't know about you, but what bothered me mostly about taking the destruction of the temples and various other religious sites of the Taliban and even ISIS, from my understanding, is that they're just so beautiful, right? They're such beautiful works of art. And I don't think you can really say that about these monuments, right? That's one. And the other thing is that you're not necessarily destroying these monuments, right? I think there are lots of other options.
Yes.
And I think some of them involve contextualizing them, and some of them involve removing them as part of contextualizing, right? So I know in Hungary, or at least I think in Hungary,
Yes,
outside of Budapest,
Yeah, we got it.
right? You've been there. There's like they have a communist park now.
A park of all sorts of statues from the Soviet period.
Yeah. So they didn't destroy them.
Stuff. Yeah, they
Yeah.
mostly did somewhere.
Yeah.
It's quite rich and private.
But they've contextualized them in their own way by putting them in one spot and saying, you know, this is sort of the message that we were sending to people.
That's very
No?
striking. Very
Yeah.
striking.
And I think
There's
that's
a
enough.
danger, though, of that becoming a shrine, too.
Yes, right.
Probably, yeah.
And a
Probably.
You see, I think that a couple of things. One is, I think we should view this not as sort of a state, but as a process. And what we're now seeing is advancing the process of ideological struggle that's redefining public history and public space. That's a good thing, you know. It would be nice for it to go further in many ways. I think it needs to be pressed. I think it will be issue, not recognition, but it's a process of struggle and redefinition. The second thing is in terms of contextualizing. That Calhoun problem, among other problem is that it's not just the image you already said, it's the location.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this location is utterly heroic and it's placed in a certain way. And it can't be allowed to stay there because any amount of placard you put up around it is not going to be effective. So I mean, that's consideration. The third thing is what you just mentioned. I also sort of agree that these historical artifacts should not be lost and that they should be used to teach.
In
about-
place, no, not in place in the park.
I would say not in place, but there's other ways to place
I
it.
agree, because it's the history of the 19 teens and 20s.
Well, that's what Ta-Nehisi Coates
Yeah.
is saying.
That's what he's
Yeah,
saying.
but that doesn't mean, I mean, and to reconcile that with your point about leaving them up in a park, or
Yeah, placement is a problem.
Orlando's point about, so that why should somebody have to walk by this statue, would be to remove them and put them in a place, right? To still get rid of them, because
Put them in place, and I mean, Coates' position, I think, is also good because we can teach and remember and learn about that at some point. A large number of important people felt that it was very important to have the founder of the Ku Klux Klan set up like this. This tells us something about the ideological history.
right,
Yeah.
right.
I generally don't agree in destroying them. Some, you know.
And we see a sort of counter narrative being done too with telling the history of slavery, not much of it, but telling the history of slavery from the black person's perspective, right?
Right.
So you have plantations all over the South that have been turned into wedding venues and the like, right? And breakfast, right? And a lot of that is erasing history itself, right? Erasing history by saying, you know, this is where the servants lived, right?
Even if.
Here's where they ate.
Yeah.
Large, beautiful meals.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
it.
Monticello had no slave quarters so long.
It had servants.
Boone Hall got theirs in 2000, and they said overtly, we don't want to air our dirty laundry before that. Before that, slave quarters just sat there, and nobody went.
So I think there's something to be said for taking these plantations and turning them into museums, but not sanitizing.
Right.
I just find that this contextualizing plaque is, I mean, when it came up, we all went, oh. I mean, that's too much to read, right? This is a great big monument, which, as you say, is so imposing, and people go by, and then you're supposed to go up here and read the disclaimer, and that just doesn't work. It reminds me.
Would it work if it was this one?
Well, even then, it reminds me of, maybe a lot of you have seen it, you know, at Plymouth Plantation, the Plymouth Rock, and there's this, but there's this rock, you know, and they say, and of course it wasn't founded until it was put up, and it's a total myth because it never landed there, and it didn't land on the rock, and the whole thing. So there's this little plaque down, so all these people come, and they all take pictures of the Plymouth Rock, which is not anything. It's in a little, you know, it's in a fenced in. And then you can go down the street there, and there's a plaque that says, "This is a myth." Nobody else ever reads the plaque, you know?
I think it's a real problem with plaques.
It's like the disclaimer for the side effects for all the drugs, right, that there's on TV.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yes. Well, those are
But
actually
you
more
want clear
valuable.
skin? Yes.
That's great.
Well, I'm wondering how these are processed sometimes, because I think it's fantastic that a mayor can make a wonderful statement like that, but how does it come about, and how do they deal with people in the city, because racism is so deeply seated, and hatred, and it doesn't go away just because we say it's not okay, or it shouldn't, or we learned our lesson. Some of these things are so deep-seated, and you got back to family roots and so forth, that I wonder what's done to process it and try to help people that don't understand
You mean
get it.
people who don't understand, who wish that they had stayed out and say
Yeah,
more hours?
absolutely, because they look at them. I mean, they have flags.
And they had a big campaign, a Take Them Down campaign, so that isn't the product of the mayor.
But
a
that's
campaign
telling
from
people
grassroots.
what to do, and that usually doesn't work. So I'm wondering how we help people to understand and learn.
It might not be unrelated to the monument, though, because that's the idea of public history, right? That Americans aren't ready to have a conversation about race because they don't understand the history of slavery. They don't understand. So, in one sense, Brian Stevenson, who's a sort of major African American figure who works at Montgomery as a lawyer, he's working very hard to increase the public history. To say, in Montgomery, if you walk down the street, he's got plaques in Montgomery that say, here's where slaves were sold. And he's creating a lynching memorial. So his idea is that, again, if only 1 in 6 Americans takes a class out of high school, and many, many high school history teachers don't even have a bachelor's in bachelor's, but not in history, then you really look more to public history. And so Brian Stevenson's trying to say, let's create lots of public history to tell people. So I do think it matters. If you walk down the street and there's a sign, because the only answer I have for you is education.
That's right,
Yeah,
but it
yeah.
has to happen because
But I think this, and I think this goes to Edward's point, taking them down is part of the education.
Yeah.
And because you get questions, people ask, why are you taking it down? It's erasing history, and then you explain to them why they want to listen, it's up to them. But the monument itself is erasing history. And there's another part to it that I think that we always need to keep in mind, and that is like, whose side are we on, or whose story do we want to tell here? And you know, white people make up the majority of this country, but in a lot of these cities, as we said, this is a majority black city, right? And And there are, of course, there's people contesting, and of course it's problematic, and of course, you know, this is a tough thing to do, and you're going to get pushback. But you're also, I think, sending a message to that part of your population, the black people, that, you know, we finally care about you, and we're listening to you. And I think that's a really, really important message.
Yes.
I was just thinking that if you're putting in more things dealing with history, you should also put in that there were a lot of people in the South who did not support the Confederacy. And particularly if you go through the mountains, they did not support,
Right.
and yet there's
Right.
nothing there about it.
That's really interesting, sort of union plaques, or at least not secession.
Yeah,
Many
not
of those
enough
plaques, by the way,
union.
many of those
They're
monument
not
things,
secession.
Yeah.
put up, even in, say, Montana, those are put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy, who actually,
Oh,
shockingly.
they ended up moving to the Confederacy.
He had it in.
I mean, Charleston is an interesting city. I was there in April of 15, the week, the 150th anniversary of when the Civil War ended. And there was no commemoration that was being held anywhere that I could find, certainly nothing official. But yet in Charleston, in the downtown, there is a building where the last slave auctions were held. They used to be held outdoors, but in the 1850s, they started moving them indoors because the city was getting a lot of bad press for it. But in the building where they had the last slave auctions, they have an excellent slavery museum there, which presents slavery in its total brutality. You know, it's really a superb.
We didn't into that one.
The bookstore is good. They have excellent books. It's really
true.
very
We like
well
that.
done.
Yeah,
And it's listed on all the tourist brochures too.
Yeah.
So if you go to Charleston and you look for what to do in Charleston, that'll pop right up there on the
Slave
web.
owners, yeah. I agree, I think that's excellent. Chip.
We've been talking about two different ways of dealing with this, the take them down, possibly destroy, or the contextualize, relocate, teaching moment. Has the fervor over the taking down, is that dying down? Are we moving more toward using this as a way to teach, to put the disclaimers up? What's the trend?
I wouldn't say yes, although I can't guarantee that, because there are still cities who are trying to take them down. I think Charleston, for instance, some people would have liked to take them down. This became, Calhoun is just too important to too many people in Charleston. It became a compromise, and the people who agreed to the language agreed because they couldn't otherwise get it through. So I would say, I would say it's location specific. And if I was going to make that division, by the way, I would put the take them down, I would put the museums there, because most of the people who take them down are not saying destroy them. They're saying they don't belong in that public place on a pedestal where people have to walk by and see that we venerate this man whose chief contribution was to support slavery. So I don't think there's a tension between taking them down and putting them somewhere for education. I think that the context is a different category because of the fact that there's that little plaque and then there's this, huge.
And I don't know of any, and I could be wrong on this, right? But I don't know of any official removal of these statues that have destroyed them, right? I don't know of any time in which the government has removed the monument and destroyed them. Now, they haven't displayed them anywhere, but I think they're talking about it, right?
They're figuring it out. In
But
fact, there are
you
laws
do
that
know,
you can't.
but you do know mobs of people, like in Durham, right? Who are, because they can, because in part because these laws say you can't take them down, people are just saying we're going to take matters in our own hands. And they destroy them.
Well, I think a point you made in the last time was they're very cheaply made.
Yeah.
And so that one in Durham fell apart.
Yeah,
So, and that's an indication that they're mass produced. A lot of them are mass produced.
The Confederate soldier one, yeah.
One of the things to think about besides the statues is the roads. The roads are not for historical purposes. A black has to ride on a road named after a Confederate general that wanted
Or go to a school called Calhoun, or go to a school called Davis.
So these are to honor these people, so those need to be changed. And the other side to it is you could put up other kinds of monuments that tell you this history from the other side.
Yeah.
And Richmond, Virginia is one of the places where they're fighting for this. this.
Yeah.
Richmond, Virginia has
Yeah.
a row called Monument Row, which is just one Confederate general after the next after the next. But the community is fighting for something called Shockoe Bottom, which was a
Yeah.
slave auction
Right.
place.
Yeah.
And the city is resisting it and had put forward different proposals. They wanted to make a baseball stadium on top of it, or they wanted to put a hotel on top of it, because they don't want to leave that space and be a monument to the terror that happened there. And that's what the black community wants.
Which is,
So there's another side to this, and that's telling the real history and taking down that history. And finally, I think this contextualist thing is just a compromise, because the movement is pushing to get rid of these things, and they're saying, okay, no, we'll stop, and here's the reason. And so it's not something that progressive people should really support. We can tell the history, and we should, from the other side, but to support something like that is not.
Well, except to the extent of Coates. I mean, I don't think Coates is ridiculous in what he says in that, you know, we need, it's not a bad thing necessarily to have a reminder that at one time these people were perceived as heroes. But I generally agree with you, right? I mean, it's like, and that could be ripped for much larger things. Enough compromise, damn it, right?
When my child was very young, I read a study that really shook me, and it said that liberal parents, in an effort to be colorblind, never talk to their children about race. And the first people who talk to their children about race are racist. The first time they hear about race are from people who have racial prejudices. And you need to not be colorblind, you need to talk and be open about it. And I think when we talk about erasing Confederate monuments and things, and we set that history aside, that history goes in the parts of the internet where we don't go. People who want to find that out are going to find it. If we have public monuments that have context, if we have monuments to slaves who led rebellions, if we have monuments and presentations that talk about the other side of the history, people who are out in public are going to see it. If we put it aside and say, oh, no, we're not going to celebrate any of that, we're going to talk about it, people are going to get their own version of history where they want it. They're not going to be confronted with it in the public space.
so what about Nat Turner right by Johnson Company?
Awesome.
No, I mean, that's kind of what you're saying, right?
He did Mark Casey.
Wait, so you have to, that's fair enough.
Because I'm in Charleston.
Yeah, so you have to have, actually, that's a great idea, Denmark Basie.
Yeah.
So, Johnson Calhoun, Denmark Basie.
Yeah.
Everywhere, so are we doing like almost one for one? Because you're saying it's part of our history, but you have to see the other side. And honestly, this idea of the plaque being profoundly insufficient, I mean, it is the case that it's a massive statue and a plaque that most people won't read. And it is the case that if you're celebrating someone who was a racist and black children have to walk by, and who was that man? Oh, he believed that people like us shouldn't read. That's tough.
I'm still one of those people who believes in truth, right? And believes that there's an accurate way of portraying history and an inaccurate way of portraying
I don't
history.
believe that.
And I think these monuments are an inaccurate way of portraying this history, whereas the Whitney plantation is, you know, what, perfect, but more accurate, which was a plantation outside of New Orleans that talks about the plantation from the perspective of the slaves. And I think it's a much more accurate portrayal of what went on in Annabelle, Louisiana.
Did I mention the lynching museum? Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing, right? If there were more of that, if we actually looked at spaces, it was space specific, on this spot, which is what they're trying to do. They're trying to get every southern town that has a record of lynching, they've got a pillar for them, and they're holding it in their big museum until the town comes and claims it and puts it in the spot where the person was lynched and says, here, this person was lynched. I don't know how long they're going to hold on to these pillars, but it's kind of cool.
Sort of like that is, you said how much we don't hear in our formal education. I had very little far knowledge that slavery existed in New York State, even though I grew up, did New York State history in college. And I was really amazed when I read that there was a slave revolt in New York City where there was a lot of slave trade.
Right.
Slave revolt was brutally put down from what I read. They were slaves captured, burned alive in the stake.
Right.
Now, that I only heard of with witches, you know, but probably it wasn't that uncommon. You mentioned religion. And
it wasn't that far removed, actually. From
that's not far from here.
Right.
You know, that's just down the river. And I don't know if there's any spot that's marked there. Any
That's a
history
good
of
question.
that?
That's the, yeah,
I don't think there
I don't
is.
think there is either. I think
I'm pretty sure there is.
That's pretty
I mean, I've looked for it.
Yeah.
Very point away. Yeah.
And only one of the three in New York State is down? There's still two remaining?
I do not know.
I don't think we're, I mean, I saw that number and thought, oh, I should be sure, but I don't know. The
Yeah.
other thing is the map shows, that map includes symbols.
Right.
So
Right.
we don't know if it's a monument.
Right.
I mean, it's some kind of,
It's a plaque. I thought
In New York
Brooklyn.
City, one was a
Brooklyn.
plaque in
Yeah.
a church, and it was removed by the diocese.
I remember that,
Okay.
yeah, that's the, wait, that's the Brooklyn one?
That, I'm not sure, I think that was
there was a
in
plaque in Brooklyn.
Manhattan. There was a
Maybe.
plaque in a church that had been put in by the Daughters of Confederacy to
Right.
mark that
And it was
at some point Robert E. Lee or someone had worshipped there, and they removed it.
Oh, yes.
He was a man of God.
I'd just like to share, because I'm progressive, a little bit of a context of the history I got of the Civil War in high school, right here in New York State, taught by a graduate of the University of Tennessee, who was a Southern gentleman. We did the entire Civil War without slavery being mentioned. The entire thing. I was amazed.
Wow.
I was amazed. In 10th grade, I was still amazed.
Wow.
And then
But you knew
the
enough
course
to be
went
amazed.
on, and we got to Prohibition. Okay? And then, so here's was his opinion. The Civil War and Prohibition, the misery of it, is caused by do-gooders. It's do-gooders that are the problem.
So that's a specific historiographical interpretation, which is one of the ways, but it's interesting though, because in the 40s, 30s and 40s mostly, this interpretation emerged, which was called the blundering generation. And this was the idea that slavery was not a big deal, hence we didn't learn about it. It was a small deal, including to the slaves. It wasn't a major part of the South. And the reason the Civil War came about is because of radicals, like abolitionists, but also the Southern pro-slavery fire eaters, but mostly the radical abolitionists who made a big deal out of nothing. And it's called the blundering generation because government is supposed to accommodate these fringe radicals, and it failed. So it was a blending generation of government officials who should have been able to deal with the normal, you know, complaints of radical crazies. Failed to do so, and we got it wrong. So all of that, your guy sounds like he was solidly in the blundering generation. What school was that?
New York.
We've got two monuments in Albany that I bet someday are going to come down.
Yeah.
There's a monument to General Philip Schuyler in front of City Hall in Albany, and he was a slave owner and Indian killer. And then in front of the state capitol is the one of the General Sheridan on the horse. And he was the one who said the only good Indians I've ever seen are dead. I'll bet the day's going to come when those are going to
Yeah,
come
they might.
down.
I mean, although, you know, then you really do get into the slippery slope question where
Oh,
you
yeah.
start to get into George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, you know, whatever.
Well, Schuyler's not the president.
I know he's not.
He's got
I know
to
he's not.
contribute enough to make it
Right.
worthwhile leaving him up. I mean, that's the
Well,
idea, right? That
he was
kind
an
of way.
important, was he a general? Yeah, important general in the Revolutionary War.
But do we have statues of all the important generals in the?
Yes,
No, I don't know.
but do we have any statues to the Loyalists? Talk about lost causes.
Sure,
Well, your ancestors were a loyalist.
Out
Yeah,
in
some of mine
Yours
are.
were.
Some of them, not all of them.
Yeah,
I'm apparently related to McClellan.
Monuments to the Loyalists. Well, in Schenectady, we have, speaking of the loyal slave, in Schenectady, we have the loyal Indian, right?
Yeah.
Lawrence the Indian, who warned the...
He warned the settlers.
Yeah, warned the settlers.
Well, we wrap up.
Yeah, they had to close.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.